経過説。Cha-ching.
So you made it through episode 1, did you? I suppose we should continue on with the show. Are you ready for more punishment? Hopefully, my assistant Colin won't put you to sleep with his monotone boring explanations. Alright, here we go.
Okay, now that the tatami mats are all removed and the floor is all clean, we can start putting in the beams. With the beams, you can either go lengthwise or crosswise. But since we are looking to make it as stable as we can, then we want to go across the old beams and not parallel to them. In this case, we can kind of go either way, only because we already have 12mm thick veneer boards underneath, but I don't recommend it. I prefer to go across the beams for the extra support. Besides, when you're doing a room that has 11mm thick planks, then you only have the choice of going crosswise. So it's good practice. When you have the planks, you can easily tell which way the beams are going. However, with these 12mm veneer boards, you have to look closely at where they are nailed down. In this case, I noticed that the beams underneath are going crosswise. Also, matching up the beams makes it easier to screw in longer screws to make the top beams more stable overall. So I will go lengthwise this time and use the 4-meter length beams, as the 6 tatami mat room length
is around 352 centimeters in length and about 264 centimeters in width.
Basically, the overall goal here is to get back the height of the room that we lost from taking out the tatami mats. Tatami mats have a thickness of around 50 to 60 millimeters. So the beams at 40 or 30 millimeters, plus the top veneer board, which is 12 millimeters, and finally the cushion flooring, which is 2 millimeters, comes to a total of 54-ish. Okay, let's get on it. The very first step before laying any beams is to check whether the current floor is level or not. If it is almost perfectly level, then the job can go very quick. But in the case it isn't, it can take a lot longer, as you will have to adjust the height of the new beams to match the level of the floor. It's just a lot easier to adjust the new beams than it is to destroy everything and fix the old beams underneath. The hardest part of not being level is that it can be unleveled at different amounts in different areas. So this can be a real fucking pain in the ass, and you'll definitely make use of a few swear words here and there as you try and figure it out, as you never know what part of the area or part of the room is higher or lower than others. Sometimes it's just one part, which makes things easier, but if it's two or more, then it can be a real bitch to get everything perfectly level. The good news is that it doesn't have to be exact. It just has to be a lot better than before, where when you're walking on it, you won't notice that it's unlevel. I've made that mistake before, where I've nailed down all the boards, and I started walking on it, not realizing that the actual original ground was unlevel. So I had to retake up those veneer boards and level everything, and then put them back down. And that took a lot longer. And that caused me to have a lot of extra work that I never planned for. So now I learned my lesson to make sure everything's level before I put those boards down. So after using my little handy level thingy, I found that the room was unfortunately not level, lengthwise and crosswise. Shit. Alright, the first step is to line up the beams lengthwise, putting one at each end and a bunch in between, leaving, say, a 20 centimeter gap between beams. The pros say that a 30 centimeter gap is good enough, but I feel 20 centimeters feels more stable, especially if you have bigger people walking on your floor. I personally feel more comfortable with having 20 centimeters. And when trying 30 centimeters, you can kind of still feel the floor giving away a bit. So that's why I choose 20 centimeters. And sometimes 25, depending how much wood I have left. But hey, the wood's not that expensive. Unless you're in Canada, in 2021. The beams aren't that expensive, so I say it's better just to be safe than sorry. Once the beams are down, you can see what areas need to be leveled by using your level between the beams. The beams are 30 by 40 millimeters, so you can use whatever side fits your situation. I start from the edges and work my way to the middle of the room, so you can check what heights are needed by seeing how level things are from the edge to the middle and from the other edge to the middle. So for example, like in my case here, the middle of the room is higher than the edges. So what I did is I used my beams at the 40 millimeter heights on the edges and 30 millimeter heights for the ones in the middle. I also use scraps of wood or other solid materials as height adjusters when needed. Here I used pieces of hard cardboard, which came from a picture, which added 3 millimeters of height, and pieces of rubber carpet, which added around 4 to 5 millimeters of height. Every millimeter counts, and you can use different scraps combined to get the height needed. It's a little Mickey Mouse, but it works, and that's all that matters. Here, the rubber carpet and the picture frames are pretty solid. So the thing that I learned when working on these big projects is to not throw everything away so soon at the beginning, as you never know what garbage might become useful at some point. And in this case, I threw away half those carpets, not realizing how useful they'd become on this project. Okay, while you're testing, don't screw anything down so soon, and just keep testing until you feel the entire room is balanced, because once you screw something down, it sucks to unscrew it. You can test either using your long level, or other pieces of scrap wood, or using an entire board to see how balanced it feels. So you can test it by looking at it or standing on it. Once you feel it's perfect, then you can start screwing them down. As you can see here, I used a variety of heights. I used the 40 millimeter edge of the beam plus the cardboard on the edge, and 30 millimeters plus carpet on the other side. And I used pieces of carpet elsewhere in the middle pieces, as you can see here. It's almost impossible to make perfect, so just try your best to get it as good as you can. I ran out of 4-meter beams, so I used 2 pieces of 2-meter long beams together to make up for the missing piece. I even made use of some of my scrap pieces of beams to add support to areas that felt like they needed it more. Oh, and I almost forgot. One very important thing when laying the beams, make sure that you lay 2 beams where 2 top layer veneer boards will connect so that you have enough room to screw it in. Technically, you can allow 2 veneer boards to share the same beam, but I find the width of the beam doesn't share well, and if you fuck up somehow, one board may take up more than the other, causing the edge of the veneer board on top harder to screw in. So I just find it a lot easier working with 2 beams, 1 for each edge of the veneer board. It just ain't worth the risk, and I'd rather have my edges sturdy. So basically make sure you have 1 beam at each edge of the 90 centimeter veneer board, or lengthwise at 180 centimeters, depending on which way your top board is going in comparison to the beams. I'm sure you can figure it out for your situation. As you can see here, in this case, I used a total of 11 beams lengthwise. Also remember that it depends on which way you place your top board, as well as their sizes, and sometimes you won't use the entire top board. Either way, I'm sure you can figure it out on your own for your situation. It's not that hard. In this case, I used a total of 11 beams lengthwise.
Excuse me? 11. I'm sure the moron meant to say 11 long beams and 2 short ones. Sorry about that.
Okay, now that we are sure that we have our beams perfectly placed in location and height-wise, we can screw them in. You'll want to use a screw length that matches the height of your beam and where it's screwing into. In this case, I used 75 millimeter length screws, and sometimes 65 millimeter screws, which are 4.2 millimeters thick. They seem to do the trick without splitting any of the beams and keeping them firmly in place. It's also possible to use thinner ones at 3.8 millimeters thick, if you fear the wood would split. Either way, you don't really need that many screws to make your beams sturdy. They are pretty strong beams. Oh, and of course, please try and screw them in where you know there is another beam underneath, just for that extra grip. Because if you screw it just into a 12 millimeter board, it won't have as strong as grip as you need. So like I said before, you can find your beams by looking at where the nails are in the old veneer boards to see where they're nailed into, or you can use a stud finder. But please make sure before you screw anything down that you have already decided each size of the top layer of veneer boards and where they will go. You don't want to have to go back and unscrew a beam just to move it over a bit. It can be a real pain in the ass. You can place the boards down as you go along just to make sure things are going correctly. Either way, make sure you constantly check how level it is between beams as you're going along. Because if you miss one unleveled beam that's not level enough, it can cause all the other beams to be unlevel and need to be refixed. Okay, now that all the beams have been screwed down, we can get on to the next step, which is cutting the veneer boards and screwing them down. The first board is usually the easiest, as you probably won't need to cut it and just place it down where you want. In this room, I chose to put the first full board down on the right lengthwise. So the next board I put down and cut is the lengthwise on the left. Both boards' width of 90 centimeters is fully used. I then decided to put 4 boards in a row and cut the tops of them lengthwise to make them fit. And the very last board will have its top and side cut off to make it fit. I will show you the easiest way to cut them. You could measure them, however, in my experience, 99% of the time, actually 100% of the time, the edges of the walls have never been perfect, making it very difficult to cut accurately by measuring. So to make things easier, all you have to do is use the boards to get a pretty accurate cut. Basically, you lift the 2 boards up and put the board that you want to cut under the other board. You then take a red pencil and draw along the edge of the top board. Watch me here as I show you getting all my boards ready to cut. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, and it's okay to have a small gap. And I actually prefer having a small gap versus not cutting enough, because if you don't cut enough, then you'll have to use a plane or sandpaper to make it small enough to fit in. And this sucks because it can ruin the edge of your board as the wood chips very easily. And this also takes a lot of time and creates more mess. I'd rather have just a little overcut where there's a gap so I can slide in nicely and easily, and I can avoid using the plane. Oh, and if your boards are also too tightly squeezing together, sometimes when you walk on them you'll hear the sound. So it's kind of better that you have a little gap, because when there's a gap, they don't make that noise as they're not touching. Okay, so now that you have the red lines, you can either cut them with a circular saw or a jigsaw. I personally use a circular saw because it's faster and cleaner, and I tend to use the jigsaw when I need specific cuts. But when it's almost a straight cut, I just usually use a circular saw. I find most of these cuts to be not exactly straight, but on an angle, but they don't go jig-jagged. Besides, the veneer boards are easier to chip, and when I use the circular saw, it does a better job than the jigsaw, as the jigsaw chips off sometimes part of the edges. I suppose if you get a better blade on the jigsaw, it'll do a good job as well though. But personally, I prefer the circular saw. Besides, it's faster. Okay, now that all the boards are in, the next step is to nail them all down, which I did in the end using 3.3 millimeter thick 30 millimeter screws. Now that the room is finished, we want to move our workstation to that room and clean up the current station area so that we can do that room next. Okay, let's get at it.
Okay, that's it for this episode. I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one, my friends.